Well, actually, it wasn't a different screen. I just needed to empty this screen so we could talk a little bit more about effortful uh, processing of information. And of course, uh, there are three different ways that I just want to highlight for you about processing information and words and so forth. One of the first ones is chunking, and the nature of chunking is such that we move information into meaningful component parts. And so essentially, uh, component and meaningful parts. Whoops, sorry. Meaningful parts. So, for example, if I were to write for you a set of numbers like this, how would you remember them? Well, typically, when we look at these, we would chunk them. We'd say 1776 is when our country was born, 1812 was a war, 1942 was the beginning of the Second World War, and 9/11 actually would become a date that we might recall in our country's history. That is an example of chunking. It's not like you would try to remember this entire string. You would break it down into component parts, and essentially you would have only 3 or 4 different pieces or chunks to remember versus 4, 8, 12, and 12 and 15 numbers instead. And that's a good example of what chunking does. When information has to be worked on in some way, that's something that we refer to as effortful. And what it does is it deepens the processing of that information, and which also means that you will remember it. Your likelihood of remembering is far greater. The second one is something we refer to as mnemonics. It has this funny way of being spelled, but mnemonics was developed by ancient Greek scholars and orators. It would use vivid imagery. It might use imagery to remember something. It might use words that lend themselves to picture images. It essentially is, again, connecting, associating images with words in order to associating images with words in order to remember them more easily. And that's part of mnemonics. You might find a variety of ways to do that in terms of the whole idea of Roy G. Biv, in terms of the spectrum of light. If you're from the upper Midwest, you might be familiar with Holmes, which is the Great Lakes, Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. Every good boy does fine. All of these are mnemonics, or ways of remembering information. Another one is the peg word system, where people use a visual code with an acoustic code as well. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is particularly helpful when it comes to studying, is something that we refer to as the spacing effect. We remember things better if it is distributed over time. A lot of students have a tendency to do what is called mass learning. And essentially, that's the other word for it, is the night before a test, you start cramming. And after a period of time, there is a decrease in your ability to put any more information into your head. The best way to do this and the best way to learn anything is distributed over time, which means starting earlier and taking smaller bits over time to do it. And when you do that, you will remember it far longer. And that's referred to as the spacing effect. Now, let's look at one last component in terms of memory when we talk about different levels of processing. Oh, I'm sorry, one last one I forgot. I got mnemonics, I got chunking. The last one, which is pictured up above, is something called hierarchy or hierarchies. And essentially, this is a good example of that, is how we remember things is by creating a hierarchy. How do these things fit together? Well, we talk about encoding and processing. We looked at a sensory memory, short-term, and effortful processing strategies, chunking, mnemonics, and hierarchies. The more sophisticated somebody tends to get in a particular area, the more likely they are to use a hierarchy to remember things. And that oftentimes is a way to work on the information. Now that's the key. That's the key. Is working on information deepens the processing, and your likelihood of remembering it is that much better. Hierarchies are such that they create a structure that allows you to remember various components of it once you remember other components of it. So once you start with effortful strategies, you go down to chunking, mnemonics, and hierarchy as the key component parts.